This is a presentation on recent research that was carried out by the Chars Livelihoods Programme's Innovation Monitoring and Learning Division. It studied the impact that CLP has had on the disaster resilience of the communities that live on the Chars. In this presentation, we'll go through the following areas. Why is it important to measure the impact of disaster resilience to people living on the Chars and CLP? What actually is a disaster resilient community? What does it look like? How did we go about measuring the disaster resilience of the communities? What were the main findings of the study? And finally, what are we going to do about it? Much of the CLP research shows that flooding and other hazards are a constant source of stress for households living on the Chars. The high asset, low asset study, recently published by CLP, found that the soil erosion was a key cause for households losing their asset base. With CLP2 ending in 2016, it is important to ensure that future shocks do not cause households to return to extreme poverty. We need to make sure that the gains that CLP households have made by the support of CLP are not lost when the next disaster strikes. So what does a disaster resilient community look like? John Twigg, a disaster resilience advisor for DFID, created a list of characters of what a disaster resilient community might have. He broke them down into 5 themes of governance, risk assessment, knowledge and education, risk management and vulnerability reduction, and disaster preparedness and response. For a community to be disaster resilient, it needs to have a government and civil society organizations which are working on disaster resilience in the area. There needs to be regular assessments, both finding what type of hazards impact the community, as well as assessing where vulnerable areas and persons are situated. Households in the community need to be educated on the hazards and trained in how to respond. A perfectly resilient community will have enough assets to use when a disaster strikes to survive and bounce back. The community also needs to have access to early warning systems and have a contingency plan for specific hazards. The actual data collection will be described in more detail in the next couple of slides, but this is just to give you an idea of how all the data collecting relates to each other. For the study, a mixed methods approach was used. A study was undertaken with 240 char dwellers, asking about aspects of disaster resilience of their community and themselves. At the same time, key informant interviews were carried out, which were then thematically analysed. We then used the answers from the key informant interviews to understand the findings in the survey. A questionnaire covering 4 main themes of a disaster resilient community was created to collect the quantitative data. The 5th theme of risk management and vulnerability has been measured substantially in other CLP studies, and so was not included. We interviewed 3 groups of key informants: staff from CLP's main office, including CLP's team leader Malcolm Marks, the program managers from our implementing organisations, and Upper chairmen from local government. Communities who received CLP support, called the intervention group, scored higher in all areas of disaster preparedness and response compared to communities who received no CLP support, the control group. Participants in the intervention group all mentioned CLP plinths as key for sheltering in disasters. Plinths also shelter cattle and protect homestead gardens. This decisively shows that CLP's plinth raising is achieving its goal of reducing vulnerability. Local markets, school compounds and roads were also used to shelter in disasters. Other NGOs have made schools into cyclone shelters as well. A regular house on a CLP plinth gives little protection from cyclones. However, cyclones rarely cause serious damage in the CLP2 working area, as it is too far inland. Both control and intervention groups scored relatively well in the knowledge of hazards and vulnerabilities. Knowing vulnerabilities and hazard risks is important. However, you also need to have the resources to make preparations for the hazards or know how to prepare for them. CLP-supported households are able to prepare, and they ensure that vulnerable persons are included in those preparations. Participants in the intervention area received more information on reducing disaster risk than the control group. It was found that 71% of survey participants in the intervention group received information on disaster preparedness. This statistic jumps to 94.6% when only looking at the survey results of women. This is complementary to the statistic that 95.2% of survey participants received information from CLP. The CLP intervention is the reason for this change in disaster resilience knowledge, as the CLP core support package focuses on women. No household in the control group received any training compared to households in the intervention group. In the intervention group, 42.5% participants received training on disaster preparedness, with 87.5% of women receiving training. Key informant interviews saw training as a role which NGOs should fulfill rather than government. This supports the idea that any single organisation, whether government or non-government, should not attempt to meet all the disaster resilience needs of a community. Rather, organisations should focus on one aspect or a limited range, causing more focused work to a higher standard. DRR governance scores were very similar, with intervention groups scoring marginally more than their control group counterparts did. In NGO, DRR work participants in the control area scored very poorly, with very little work done by NGOs. Bangladesh has a number of policies at the national level to implement disaster risk reduction activities in response to the Hyogo framework. The government recently put into action the National Plan for Disaster Management 2010 to 2015 and the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy paper. When asked what type of risk assessment survey participants were involved in, the only type mentioned was social mapping of vulnerable areas in the village. CLP carried out the majority of assessments during CLP's Social Development Programme, with a small proportion, 2%, by CARE through their Shahado programme. Survey participants did not mention other risk assessments, which may reflect a lack of community involvement. During the KIIs, interviews discussed other assessments. When CLP, for instance, first came to the Chars, they carried out hazard and vulnerability assessments to identify areas of high priority. CLP carried out these assessments in 2004, and participants may have forgotten or, more likely, migrated to the area after the assessment. The graph below shows that intervention communities scored higher in all 4 thematic areas. This quantitatively shows the positive impact that CLP has had on the disaster resilience of communities on the Chars. Women in the intervention group have greater resilience than men, whereas in the control group the men have marginally more resilience than women do. CLP has improved the resilience of the community and in the process also empowered women. One of CLP's core outputs is enhanced status of females and girls. DRR training and support helps achieve this output. With more resilience to disasters and knowledge in how to respond to them, females play a greater role in the response and grow in status in the household. The study also found that instead of households losing disaster resilience after the CLP support package ends, disaster resilience sustains and even grows. This may be from spillover effect of being in villages which are in close proximity to villages supported by the CLP package. Men are also learning from the women about disaster resilience, and as they learn, the whole community's resilience as a whole in turn increases. The study found that after CLP support, the disaster resilience of communities dramatically improved in all 4 themes. Women's disaster resilience became greater than men's, particularly in knowing how to prepare for disasters. With more knowledge on how to respond to disasters, females will play a greater role in the response and will grow in status in the household. It became clear during the interviews that NGOs and local government each need to play specific roles in building disaster resilience of communities, as one organisation cannot do it alone. Communities saw CLP plinths as vital for sheltering during floods, which is the most common hazard on the Chars. The study also found that instead of households losing disaster resilience after the CLP support package ends, disaster resilience sustains and even grows. This may be from spillover effect of being in villages which are in close proximity to villages supported by the CLP package. Men are also learning from the women about disaster resilience, and as they learn, the whole community's resilience in turn increases. One aspect where there appeared to be a gap was the lack of regular assessment on hazards and vulnerability. In the interviews, respondents said that as hazards did not change on the Chars, there was no need for further risk assessments. With climate change, however, this is not necessarily true. It is predicted that as the average global temperature rises, there will be an increase in disaster frequency and magnitude. CLP households who have graduated out of extreme poverty need to know and understand future threats, so these shocks and stresses do not cause them to fall back into poverty. The key recommendations of this study are to continue the approach to building disaster resilience communities, encourage Char stakeholders to carry out risk assessments in the future, and to distribute new Bangladesh policies to key actors, accompanied with a workshop. Thank you for watching our presentation. To find out more about the study and our other work that CLP does, please visit our website at www.clp-bangladesh.org.